Good morning, and welcome to this week's webinar. I always struggle for topics to sort of talk about, but this week, in the last couple of weeks, the reason I chose the topic today of strange things is because there's been a couple of stories told me that have started to make me think about the strangeness of things. Now, all of us in our lives have encountered odd things that have happened, and most of the time what happens is something happens and you go, oh, that's a coincidence, or you kind of, you don't make too much of it at the time, but it's normally afterwards that you tend to sort of reflect on these moments and think to you, and then it sort of hits you later and you think, oh, that was weird. Or sometimes something happens and you'll find something strange about it afterwards. I've got a particular story for that. But just lots of little things that I find strange. I come walking the dog the other day and sort of looked at the moon, and I started thinking about lunar eclipses and solar eclipses, sorry, and both. And everywhere you look, there's some odd things about life and about the way things are. And I'm not really sort of proposing that you sort of read too much into them. I don't, I mean, for me, some of them are very important. Some of them I'm not so sure about, because we do live in a world in which we kind of try and tease out these things. But nevertheless, we acknowledge that there are some things in life that are particularly inexplicable and odd. And I'll just go through that a little bit. So I thought, well, where do we start? Well, I thought, well, the first thing we'll start with, that's my dog behind me, by the way, it was strange. Do you mind? She doesn't. Let's think about the universe. So, I've got a book which is called A Fine-Tuned Universe, and it was written by Alister McGrath, and it's about why the universe is the way it is. So I thought we'll start big, and then we'll sort of incrementally get down to the personal. So it's interesting to know that actually, I'm no scientist, by the way. But the thing that I found really interesting is an argument called the fine tuning. And there's lots of, arguments about this fine tuning. How sharp is this knife that we're balanced on, the laws of nature? But there is one law in particular that's really important, and this is called the cosmological constant. And the cosmological constant is a force found in nature which is anti-gravitational. So gravity does this, and the cosmological constant is a force that does this. And so it has a huge effect upon the way the universe is. Okay. And it's set at such a precise force that if it was any different, there wouldn't be life in the universe. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the precision of the setting of that force. It is 123 zeros. So that's 123 of them. That's how finely tuned that force is. And then if you look at that, you have to say to yourself, well, why is that? Why are the laws of nature so finely tuned for life that if it was just a little bit this way, there wouldn't be any life, and if it was a little bit that way, there wouldn't be any life either? And it seems to be that the universe is, I use the word cautiously, designed, because there's a common theory called intelligent design, which I'm not a great fan of. And actually, nobody should be. But that's not to say that there doesn't seem to be design. Okay, intelligent design means something else. It's a different theory. But there seems to be a very finely set parameters on the laws of nature which enable life to exist. But it's not the only things. Like you could have a universe without protons or whatever, and maybe. But I find that strange, isn't it? When you look at it, you find it strange. And there are three common responses to this. So physicists, not all of them, but tend to not like the idea of God, because you can't calculate God. So most physicists want the laws of nature to be impersonal, mathematical, and nothing else to it. So you can sort of, grasp it. And most physicists are out to be famous. They want to be the next Einstein. So there's a lot of riding on their theories, which is why scientists, well, I would say theologians are a bit like this as well, but scientists in particular are never in doubt, but often wrong, because something else comes along and displaces your theory. Now, there are three responses to why the universe is so finely tuned to life. Well, you know what I think, and I'm pretty sure most of you watching, what do you think? But the three responses is God. I hasten to add, though, when you say God, I mean, that still doesn't define what kind of God you're talking about. You're talking about the God of Aristotle, or you're talking about the God that we understand of Christianity, or are you talking about something else? There's so there's still a sort of broadness in that term, God. The next one would be accident. It's completely accidental. So I suppose into this you could put in the multiverse. So the multiverse is basically a theory which is designed to get around the inference that there is a God. So if you're a physicist and you can't stand the idea that a finely tuned universe points to God, then you have to look for another theory. Well, the multiverse is one of the last hiding places of the atheist. That's another one. Another one is not the multiverse, but the megaverse. This is quite interesting, that the universe is absolutely much bigger than what we think it is, and it has different laws in different areas. I struggle with that one a little bit. I struggle with the other two, because I think, me personally, I think they're theories that are designed to run away from what they point towards, from what the physics points towards. A creation out of nothing, Big Bang, we've got that. A finely tuned one that enables life. Yeah, we've got that. And it seems to point towards a creator. Now, if you can't stomach that pointing, then you have to come up with something else. I understand that. Okay. So that's the first thing, that the fact that there is something rather than nothing, and that it yields life, which we know it does because we're here and we think about, that's the strangeness in itself, isn't it? There's a strangeness which is at the foundation of everything. Full stop. Okay, but the other day, walking the dog, so looking at the moon, beautiful, like harvest moon. Reminds me of a very good Neil Young song. Love Neil Young, excellent. And I started thinking about solar eclipses. Now, solar eclipses are a remarkable, strange thing. Did you know this? You probably did. So it goes something like this. So the sun is yay big, and the Earth is tip of my finger. And in between us and the sun is the moon. Now, the sun, if I'm right, is, I might have got this wrong. It's something like, I don't know, 400 times. Let me have a look at the thing. So the moon is exactly 400 times smaller than the sun's diameter, and the sun is almost exactly 400 times further away than the moon. And what that means is the sun is yay big, the moon is yay big, and it's placed at a very precise point between us and the sun in which it completely eclipses the sun. That's odd. It's very strange, because there may be moons around other planets, but the chances of there being full eclipses is very slim. It's very finely set in space. Now, one article says, oh, well, that's not always going to be the case, because the moon is moving away from the Earth at the rate that your fingernails grow. So in a trillion years' time or a billion years' time, it may be slightly out, but that's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is, at the point in time on this planet where there are conscious, independent creatures like ourselves, the moon is set exactly in the right place to eclipse the sun. And that is a strange thing, I find. It just so happens to be at the right place between us and the sun in order to completely eclipse it. If it was a little bit smaller or further away or closer, it wouldn't do that. And that's strange, particularly when you consider that it's around the only planet where we know there is life, intelligent life. Although, if you watch the American presidential debate, you may question that theory, but we're not going to do politics today. So that's a strangeness of life. Now, there are other strangenesses of nature, aren't there? The condition of water is a very strange thing, but we haven't got time to go into that. I'm going to move on to other things. So you can say that, one, the universe is a strange place, strangely tuned to life, and the moon is strangely positioned, that we have eclipses around a planet where there's life, the only place we know there is life, which, strange. So the next thing is, well, let's look at the strangeness of things. So I told you this story once before. Relatives of mine, both in the same room, and somebody appeared at the door, run along the wall, jump through the wardrobe. Two people saw what we would call a ghost in a house in London. And but this comes on the back of other strange events that happened in the house. Now, I've never seen anything like that. But the interesting thing is, I think, is that you had two people here who see the same thing and relate the same story. And I heard the story from both of them at the same time. The other thing to remember in this is that the two people that saw this event are agnostics, as far as I'm aware. So it didn't convince them of anything, but they didn't deny what they saw. They saw a man run through their bedroom and jump through the wardrobe. That's the shortened story. I think I've told this story somewhere else. That's a strange thing. And there is no explanation, not that I know of. So, and everybody has a strange sort of, they've heard stories like this. Now, we've all heard stories like this. And to be honest, I'm as cynical and as skeptical as anybody else. You might find that hard to believe, but I think, but that's reasonable, because we all know the power of the human mind. And we all know the desire to be different and all that kind of thing. But the compelling thing about this story is two people saw the same thing and they weren't looking for anything out of it. They weren't looking for any recognition. It didn't support their worldview. You know, that's why this story is, for me, is really interesting. And that's not always the case. So that's an odd story. The other thing I want to get onto is coincidences. I talked to this lady once who had a child baptized, and she couldn't have children, and so they thought about getting some help. The problem was that getting the help was very expensive, and they couldn't really afford it. Anyway, the lady's one of the lady's relatives died. It might have been a nan or auntie or something. Left her some money, and so decided to spend that money on getting some help to have a baby. So they spent that money, one shot, on getting a baby. And I know people that have had help getting babies and spent a fortune and had multiple times, and it's not happened. This lady spent the money and had one shot, got pregnant, had the baby on the birthday of the person who died and left her the money. That's odd. That's very strange, isn't it? And it's packed with meaning. And I had the privilege of baptizing this baby. And that's such a special story. And I'll never forget that. It's bizarre. Also, you know, there are things that have happened that, you know, where I always think it's interesting, those sorts of things, you know, where it seems to be a coincidence, but there's always the question, isn't there? Is there more? Now, I'll tell you about my coincidence. My big coincidence was I had a call into the ministry. And I wouldn't say that I was your prime candidate at the time. Well, I may not be the prime candidate now, but I've come a long way. I sometimes think I'm still a bit of a rough diamond, but if you'd have known how rough I was to start with, you'd see the progress. But yeah, so I set off on this journey to be ordained, and it was a bit of a slow start because I had a few hurdles. But once I got going, yeah, it's great, and went through first time, and just all the doors that I expected to not open opened, and I just seemed to go through one after the other. I was amazed. And I remember coming out of the selection conference, jumping in my car, which I had to get push started. It was a bit of an old banger. And I like old bangers because if you wreck them, it doesn't matter. Got a nicer car now, though. Not that nice. And I remember driving away thinking, well, I'll never do that again. It's not nice. It was all right. But it's scary putting your life in somebody else's hands, isn't it? Anyway, got a yes. Went off and trained. I got ordained in 2008 as a deacon in Hereford Cathedral. Not a terribly emotional person, but I have to say I had a pretty big lump in my throat when I walked through those doors. It was moving. Anyway, ordained. And the following year, you have to get ordained. You get ordained a priest. So every vicar is a priest, and every priest is a deacon. So you can't be a priest unless you're a deacon. Okay. And it's not rank; it's different offices. So I'm a deacon and I'm a priest. It's not like it's not hierarchies. I've got two ministries that sit alongside each other. Okay, so I was ordained a priest, and I remember being sat on the bed in the bishop's palace, and I thought I'd just go through my stuff. So baptism certificate, and I looked at my baptism certificate, and I noticed the date. It was the 29th of June, 1975. And I thought, oh, well, that was the date last year when I got ordained. And it turned out that I was ordained a deacon on the 29th of June, 2008. So I was ordained on the same day that I was baptized. And you say, well, that's a bit of a coincidence, but here's the kicker. It was 33 years after I was baptized. Now, what age was Jesus when he died and rose again? 33. And it's interesting, actually, because some of you may know I study Augustine, and Augustine was ordained at the age of 33. But the interesting thing is I was not only ordained 33 years to the day I was baptized, I was served in the same church that I was baptized. It's an odd thing, isn't it? And I can tell you that when I was, growing up, being ordained in the church wasn't on the list. It just wasn't even on the radar. So there's a funny old thing. Coincidence or not? Well, you know what I think. So there's coincidences. This is an interesting story. Recently, I was quite interested in one of the founding fathers of psychology, which is Carl Jung. Now, Jung is a bigger character as Freud. In fact, in my view, he's much better than Freud, because Freud's methods are slightly, questionable. But Jung was one of the people that who knew Freud. He was one of the founders of what we call a modern psychology. Now, some people like Jung, some people don't like Jung. But Jung's having a bit of a comeback at the moment. But Jung tells an interesting story in which he runs a psychiatric ward, and he has patients. And the old title for his profession was called an alienist. Quite interesting, isn't it? And Jung records that in life, often his patients would have visions of the future. There would be odd things that they would know that they shouldn't know. And he recounts one story where a patient grabs Jung by his coat, his doctor's coat, and leads him to the window and points at the sun. And he points Jung to the sun, and he recites basically this ancient liturgy about the sun. Okay. Anyway, Jung never thought much of it. But 4 years later, he read a paper by a scholar called Dietrich. And in this paper, this scholar had discovered an ancient liturgy and published the liturgy in the paper. And it was the same as his patient recited. Now, there's no way his patient could have known this, because it hadn't even been published. And the patient didn't have any particular education, young man. And what Jung observed is that behind the consciousness of his patients, sometimes something else would pour through, like as if there were a great consciousness behind every consciousness. And sometimes there would be little piercing lights that would come through. And this fascinated Jung. And it's quite interesting that there's such a strangeness. He observed such a strangeness to the human condition and the human mind. Now, this kind of leads me. I did aim for a webinar for about half an hour today, short one, because we've got a lot going on in the church. So, but this leads me on to, what the conclusion I'm pointing at. That in the beginning of John's Gospel, we're told about the Word, the Logos, the mind, the rationale of God. And that this rationale becomes incarnate in the person that we know. It's called Jesus. And what the story tells us is that the mind behind all minds, and the mystery behind all mysteries, and the mover behind all things, presents himself within the created order. Now, in the ancient world, they knew strange things as much as we do, probably more, because they paid more attention. We tend to be quite dismissive of the strangeness of life. But there's one thing that happened to them that was even so strange for them. That there was this man, Jesus, who was amazing, had great authority. He could do things, such strange things, by himself. But in the end, this person was handed himself over to be crucified behind me. And then they saw him again. And yet Jesus could eat and drink, and yet he could appear and disappear. He was the same, but completely different. There was a strangeness to Jesus. They could recognize him. Sometimes they didn't recognize him. The strangeness confronted them in all manner of ways. And it was that strangeness that led them to tell the world about this strange man called Jesus, who provides what I would say is a window into why the world is so strange and mysterious, despite the fact that we like to think that we have a handle on everything. Now, just to end, I'm going to read this. It's from the Psalms. It's Psalm 33. The psalmist writes, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all the hosts by the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea as in a bottle, and he put the deeps in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm." In the beginning of John's Gospel, we're told, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through him, and not one thing came into being that was not through him. In him was life, and the life was the light of all men. We have a framework and an explanation for the strangeness of life. Indeed, the fine-tunings of the universe, the moon, the strangeness of life's stories, the coincidences that tell us that there is more to our life than just ourselves and our perception of in complete control of its destiny. Signs, we call them in the church, signs of God's presence, signs of God's touch. And that is the basis of faith. It's not that we believe anything. It's that we're able to have enough evidence, enough experience, enough knowledge in order to make the leap in a reasonable direction. I've never found God an unreasonable proposition. But there again, I suppose in a way it's been easy for me, because once you're touched by God in here, you can't ever be untouched. And it stays with you. And when I look out through this experience, this love of God which lives in you, I'm able to see more clearly the stars, the signs, and the wonder of the strangeness of God's creation and of life. See you next week, and don't be afraid to suggest a topic. See you then. Okay.